Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
The interesting thing about the automobile industry is that in a town like Detroit, you know who your competition is, and every 10 days you see how you're doing in comparison to them. What's Iacocca doing to you today, or what are you doing to him? So it's a really intense sense of competition, and the whole organization feels it. It's a very healthy thing.
My guest today is reporter and author Hillel Levin. His reporting has appeared in The Nation, New York Magazine, Monthly Detroit Magazine, Metropolitan Detroit Magazine, and Chicago Magazine. He was executive editor of Metropolitan Detroit and editor of Chicago Magazine. In 2004, he wrote When Corruption Was King with Robert Cooley about Cooley's central role in the FBI investigation of mob influence on Chicago's courts and political system. In 2007, for Playboy, he wrote Boosting the Big Tuna about the burglars who broke into the home of Tony Accordo, the longtime leader of Chicago's mob, which is known as The Outfit. In 2010, he wrote In with the Devil with James Keene about Keene's undercover mission to crack a serial killer in a federal psychiatric prison. Also in 2010, he wrote How the Outfit Killed JFK, which is the basis for Assassination Theater. When Corruption Was King and In with the Devil are currently in development for motion pictures, along with Boosting the Big Tuna, which will be known as Idol's Eye. It is scheduled to start filming in Chicago this fall with Robert De Niro, Robert Pattinson, and Rachel Weisz. But he may be best known for his reporting and writing on John DeLorean, which led to the publication of his book Grand Delusions, The Cosmic Career of John DeLorean. And that will be our topic of discussion today. The book now includes a new afterword about the extreme measures DeLorean took against the author. And that story is featured in the new Netflix documentary, Myth and Mogul, John DeLorean. And we are very pleased to have the noted journalist and author with us today. Welcome, Hillel.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Well, before we get into the history and this amazing story, you actually get an opportunity to interview and speak. So what is it like to meet John DeLorean?
Well, the first time I spoke with him, I was a pretty young reporter, and he had, no doubt about it, a lot of charisma. And he also had an ability to kind of size you up and tell you what you wanted to hear. And I think that was probably one of the most dangerous things about this man's success. And he, unfortunately, over the course of many years, kind of felt he could get away with telling reporters not just what they wanted to hear, but things that they wouldn't necessarily want to check.
Hillel, it is tradition here to accompany the discussion with a special brew. Today we have Enchantment Under the Sea Hops Double IPA from the Great Heights Brewing Company of Houston, Texas. Enchantment Under the Sea is a West Coast-styled American double IPA, double dry hopped with Columbus, Centennial, and Citra hops. And I absolutely love their logo featuring Doc Brown and Marty McFly standing in front of that iconic school dance poster from the movie Back to the Future. So I have to commend Great Heights for an outstanding label for their Enchantment Under the Sea Hops Imperial Double IPA. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply click on the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get new material immediately after it is published. Subscribing, it's the only way to get those new shows right away. And to the ever-expanding list of supporters and listeners from over 70 countries and 1,000 cities across the United States, I have to say thank you. And now I raise my enchantment under the Sea Hops Double IPA very high. And I want to remind you, if you're going back in time, I figure you better do it in style. So John's father is an immigrant, and like most immigrants, he has a tough blue-collar existence. What's the background, then, of John DeLorean's parents?
What I learned, first of all, walking in there for my first interview, I was very much influenced by what he wrote with Pat Wright, and On a Clear Day, You Can See General Motors.
Right.
And he gave you the impression that the father was this rough and tough guy, an assembly line worker. Mother was much more refined, very ambitious. At times, he has said the father was a drinker, was very physical with him. In fact, he said that to me, during my taped interviews with him. But of most interest, he gave me the impression that the parents were from Alsace, Lorraine. And one of the more interesting aspects about DeLorean was how throughout his life he continued to reinvent himself. And one of these reinventions was putting a space between the D-E and the L to make it seem more French. Well, in fact, the father was from Romania. And who told me this? But one of his close friends who ended up doing pretty well himself, owning an engineering business. And, everyone in that neighborhood was from, for the most part, Eastern Europe. And there was a clique of Romanians. In that era, sometimes people wrongly associated Romanians with the Romaine, in other words, gypsies. So there was some little embarrassment about that. Certainly his friend was never embarrassed about his roots. But this is that fascinating thing about DeLorean, is how much he would go into every aspect of his personality as time went by to reinvent himself to something he thought was more desirable or fashionable. And I can't think of any more in-depth way of reinventing yourself than reinventing your heritage. Now, as far as what his father did, he told me a story about his father having to deal with the humility of Ford service people. And that was a Ford Motor Company Secret Service breaking into the home and checking to see if he stole tools. I mean, that may in fact have been true and may have in fact have been the case. But on the other hand, one of the friends told me it was his belief the father was actually a member of the Ford service group. And that would not have been so unusual. They really did recruit people, often immigrants who had not fit in very well with the other employees, often people with some kind of law enforcement background. And evidently the father had been a security guard, as he told me. So again, here are the contrasts in DeLorean's life. In terms of personal life, the parents were frequently separated, and the mother would go to Los Angeles with her family, and he grew up kind of betwixt and between, but very close with the mother. And so reading between the lines, you see someone growing up not quite fitting in with the neighborhood, having to deal with this personal turmoil, and with a sense of himself that, again, maybe he wanted to remake, in all those times, I'm sure, that he suffered that were pretty solitary. But I should add, he had some younger brothers. The family as a whole was very successful. So somebody did a good job bringing them up.
I'm wondering about his background because he becomes a very successful automobile engineer and, of course, executive. So what's his education? And you can throw in his military service as well.
Well, the one thing about Detroit is it really was the working man's paradise. In other words, you could move to that city, not really have much in terms of your financial background, not really having much in terms of even your command of the English language. And your kids could go to really good schools. And if they were smart, they could get into some schools that require them to pass exams to get into. And DeLorean got into Cass Tech. And Cass Tech High School was almost, part of the assembly line of how the big three recruited young people out of Detroit, educated them, and moved them up through the corporation. So the kids at that school received an excellent education. And of course, the dream of a lot of them, and at the point when DeLorean went there, it was all male, was to become engineers and to, go into the auto industry, become the next Henry Ford. And he had an acumen, especially when it came to drafting, that was so good that they would literally post his work like art projects on the wall.
Wow.
And some of his classmates remembered, walking by, a couple of years later and still seeing his blueprints on the wall. So he's somebody who really took to that, who was a bright kid, who then went to Lawrence Tech. Now, that's not like going to Lehigh. It's not a school that people would know outside of Detroit. But again, it was very much geared to getting you ready to enter one of the car companies. I said the big three, but in those days you had a couple of others. And he went from there right into Packard, which was a company that ultimately went out of business, but was very innovative and really was another type of education. He wasn't one out of hundreds. He was working with small teams and really learned to innovate in a way that helped pave his path at General Motors. There was this other element to him that I discovered, and this is whenever you talk about DeLorean, you just have to be aware of this sort of double life, if not triple or quadruple life that he led. And, there was this element of the con man and the fabricator about him. And at one point at Lawrence Tech, he started going around pretending to represent the Yellow Pages. And the Yellow Pages, for people who don't remember back then, we used to get phone books, and the front of the phone book was white pages, back of the phone book was Yellow Pages, and in those Yellow Pages were all the business ads, and in the white pages were all the residential numbers. And I should say the business numbers and ads that would go with them. And DeLorean had taken, he might have shown an interest in the law, but he took a course on intellectual property at Lawrence Tech. And in looking up trademarks, he realized that the Bell Telephone Company had not trademarked Yellow Pages. So he thought he could get away with selling ads for the Yellow Pages and then only printing up, a relative small number of books, and he would somehow get away with that. And of course, he didn't get away with it, and it could have gotten him into a lot of trouble. Maybe not that he would have gone to jail or prison over it, but it did take the intercession of that professor from school that person was teaching the law to intervene for him. And the friends remembered that this was another aspect to DeLorean's personality at this point, because he had gone from, a kid his classmates in high school remembered as kind of a pencil neck geek, is how they described him to me, to this big man on campus, even though it wasn't a very big campus, at Lawrence Tech. And he was, in those days, kind of a good-looking guy, and he was writing a column for the newspaper, which, was very well written. This guy had a very good command of the language, even at that point in his life, not typical for your typical engineer. And he, in these columns that he was writing, kind of humorous columns, he was also reinventing himself as a man about town, a hepcat, as they would have said in those days. And he was evidently a really good dancer and really pursued a lot of women and let everybody know it. So again, this was another part of the man's reinvention.
I'm wondering about that type of person when he enters the Army to be a con man. That doesn't really fit the culture of the military. and I've spent several years in the Army myself, it doesn't fit the fabric of the military at all. So how is DeLorean able to assimilate into that culture when he's drafted in 1943?
I think he's a chameleon. I really do. I think, he was lucky in that he never left a stateside base, was never exposed to combat in any way. But for this image he painted of himself as the rebel at GM, his superiors at Packard, for example, remembered him as kind of a brown noser. As soon as he got there, he wore the company shirt, so to speak. He knew how to turn up at the water cooler at the appropriate time. He did everything he was told to be successful in that environment. So I'm sure in the military, he did much the same.
You already mentioned Packard, and that's actually how he gets his foot in the door of the auto industry. But how does he get into General Motors and then rise in their hierarchy?
Well, I'm trying to think of the proper analogy, but again, because you had this underfunded, overmatched auto company, the typical engineer had a lot more experience and a lot more exposure to all aspects of automobile manufacturing than they would have had at a big company, where you tend to be pigeonholed. Sometimes you're pigeonholed into, one piece of the carburetor. I mean, I'm not kidding you. So he was exposed to much more of the car. And he was also exposed to a company that in those days was really believed strongly that if they didn't innovate, if they weren't on the edge of innovation, they were going to die. Maybe they're going to die sooner than they expected to die, but that was their impression. So a lot of things that later became extremely innovative for the rest of the industry, I mean, to the best of my memory, I think they were one of the first with push button transmission, which actually did not last very long, but it's very cutting edge at the time, and was an indication of the type of company they were. So when you ultimately left Packard, if you weren't recruited out of there, you were very much in demand. And the most important thing for DeLorean is that when he landed at GM, it was under the tutelage of Bunky Knudsen, who's was one of the auto industry royalty. His father, I believe, was a senior executive at Ford and some other companies. And, DeLorean later took a lot of credit for revolutionizing Pontiac when he became first chief engineer and then general manager. But it was Bunky Knudsen who said, you can sell a young man's car to an old man. You can never sell an old man's car to a young man. He took Pontiac, which was, a very old-fashioned brand at that point for General Motors, and started it on the path of, revolutionizing it. And all the more reason why he was attracted to this bright young engineer.
So is it the development then of, I think you're kind of referencing this, to the Pontiac GTO? Is that really what catapults him into the next stratosphere in General Motors?
Again,
is that overstating it, or?
It is somewhat overstating it, I think, because I don't want to diminish the fact he was a real capable engineer and he had patents in his background. It's as you research, you realize he had these mentors who were also very accomplished and also deserve a lot of credit. And, there would have never been a Pontiac GTO without Bunky Knudsen saying, what I just said about old men buying a young man's car. So he got that path going. So did Pete Estes, who was a general manager before DeLorean and who was in the engineering role that DeLorean was in, overseeing him at Pontiac. And, he had those forebears. So where did DeLorean come in that was really path-breaking? I think his greatest success was his flair for marketing. And that did set him apart from a lot of the car guys. And, and you see there is this divide in the automotive world between the real hardcore Henry Ford type engineers and then the marketing wheeler dealer guys, especially personified by William Crapo Durant, the guy who built GM into kind of a Goliath, by acquiring a lot of companies. And DeLorean was fairly unique and you could say this somewhat too later about Iacocca, but where he had a flair for marketing. And he ultimately, I believe, it's very ironic because he started out in, really things like the transmission, the most unglamorous parts of a car. That's where he made his bones. And ultimately, where he found his greatest success was understanding that, cars are one of those rare products where people love the wrapping more than the contents. And that the design of the body and how you marketed it was far more important than what was under the hood for the most part. Obviously, he was pushing a lot of the high performance cars, especially younger people who wanted to race with them. But aside from that, it was really understanding how to mix that marketing with the fastest growing demographic as far as car buyers were concerned. And that was, the burgeoning youth explosion of the late 50s and 60s. And what he did that was, path breaking for sure was taking some of the rock and roll music of that era and incorporating it into the advertising. And that went very much against the grain for some of the people in Pontiac and some of the ad agencies. But again, he had a great executive at one of those ad agencies who totally got it, who was very much a part of that lifestyle, understood, where the younger generation was going. And, DeLorean did a good job of supporting him in his ideas. But, when it came to something like GTO, that was DeLorean's idea to bring that kind of French racing style and Italian racing style, I should say, to a GM Pontiac car and really change the image.
Big stick, gonna pull the big machine. Style, oh, it just melts, so clean. Wheel, tough as leather, big and fat black. Pipe, open wide, can't get no one talking back. It's the Humblers, GTO, Pontiac, the way it's gonna be. Hold up, sing your song or you're humming. Horses, do your stuff, keep it coming. Mountain, step aside or lay down.
The Humbler is here. This is the way it's going to be, baby.
So GM is notoriously, at that time anyway, very buttoned up, gray suits, very conservative. How does he fit into that culture? Is he just brown-nosing in the beginning and wearing the gray suits, but then eventually becomes more flamboyant and reaching out to that youth movement, as you mentioned?
You've got it totally brown-nosing, totally going in with a tie and jacket. We can see the clips. We can see, as time does to all of us, getting a little heavier, a little more in the jowls, no longer pencil-necked under any form of description, kind of a beefy guy and looking very much like the typical GM executive, but was definitely in the right place at the right time, definitely promoted in the right way. And the biggest transformation for him personally was when he went from engineering to being an actual general manager. And as I said before, a lot of the people from that engineering background were like oil and water with the dealers. DeLorean loved the dealers, and the dealers loved him. And I don't want to be negative about dealers, but there was that element in him that really enjoyed slapping people on the back. Again, he would sit there, listen to somebody, listen to their complaints, was not dismissive in a way sometimes the engineering guys were. But I think he really loved the lifestyle, and especially the lifestyle once he got to LA and, California in general, where you had some of the biggest dealers in the United States who, these were the guys with the gold chains around their wrists that eventually became the gold chains around their neck and the open button shirts. And, DeLorean found a good reason to hang out ultimately, with some of the advertising people and, go on the set when they were making those commercials. So he definitely gravitated to all of that. And that's when you start to see him lose weight, lift weights, wear more fashionable clothes, and even, get significant cosmetic surgery himself in ways that, shocked his longtime friends. So again, and, this was another part of that reinvention that kept going on with this man, throughout his life. And once, he gravitated up for the very short period he ran Chevrolet, which, was kind of being a prelude to someday being the president of GM. He, in fact, did become pretty bulletproof. And I think there was a lot of regard that this guy knew things other people didn't. But let me tell you, behind the scenes, this guy was a real mover and shaker. He knew who to kiss up to, even as he rose higher. He knew the various personalities in the auto world, in the auto trades, to romance, so to speak. And he had a lot of wind at his back at that point. And he really could get away with some things like showing up in jeans or without a tie. Not all the time, though, but, on rare occasion.
What leads to his end at General Motors? Does it have something to do with that jet setting and that type of mentality?
It has something to do with that, but it has more to do with what I said was the con man in him that came out at times when he felt nobody was looking over his shoulder. So the important thing to do when evaluating DeLorean's past is to look in a number of areas at actual timelines. He was the head of Chevrolet for a pretty short period of time. When he first came in there was a recession, but the numbers turned around. It was doing pretty well. And then he was yanked out pretty unceremoniously, under 2 years. And again, the way succession worked at General Motors, once you were GM at Chevrolet, you would then follow into the corporate suite. And Pete Estes was ahead of him, on that kind of 3, 4, 5-year track. And he ultimately did become president. So, first of all, there was no way DeLorean was going to leapfrog Pete Estes. So all these things, and again, you've got to look at the myth that he began to spin once he left, and you realize, some of this stuff really didn't fit. And why was he pulled out of there? Well, the reason he was pulled out, I strongly believe, is because of a company called United Visuals. And United Visuals was a partnership with an individual he met in LA who was definitely one of those gold chain wheeler dealer guys, somewhat peripherally involved in show business and entertainment. And DeLorean did gravitate to several of those people. And he came up with this idea of putting what was a very primitive video device into the dealerships. And this video device would run these, early videotapes. They were not really film yet. They were beyond film, but you couldn't really record over them. And pretty much DeLorean shoved that device down the throat of every one of, I think it's like 2,000 Chevrolet dealers. And the worst part of this device was every model year, you had to buy new cassettes, so to speak, to show that video. So people were really, not only locked into something that a lot of them felt they didn't necessarily need, but then they were forced to spend over and over and over again. So how do I know DeLorean was a partner? Because, after he left General Motors, his dealings with that partner fell apart, and he proceeded to sue him for his half of the business. And all of this is in court documents, that anybody could pull up and read. And during his court testimony, he was as brazen as saying, of course I was instrumental with, getting this business. Without me, this guy would have never gotten it.
To switch tracks just a little bit, DeLorean was married 4 times. Is there any easy way to sort out his personal life?
Well, again, that's another area where things are not what they appear to be. I think he brags a little too much about what a playboy he was and his success with women. As I said, you got to look at the timeline. When I put all the dates together, here's a guy who was single only 6 months, for a lot of his adult life until after he divorced Christina Ferrari. So he had a wife of, I think it was 16 years, his first wife, and she was the very typical General Motors wife. They lived in a nice home in Bloomfield Hills. She did all the things that corporate wives were supposed to do in those days, involved in charities and all the rest. But when he divorced her, it was in the midst of this, what some people have called a midlife crisis. But again, that reinvention we discussed about him losing all the weight and, embracing the youth generation, wearing Nehru jackets. And he married the daughter of Tom Harmon, Kelly Harmon. Her brother's Mark Harmon. People know him from TV fame and several different shows. But Kelly was very attractive. Tom Harmon himself was in Michigan like a god. This guy was not just a great football player, one of the greatest ever for University of Michigan, but was also a war hero and married to a film star himself, and yet was kind of buddy-buddy with DeLorean. They really hit it off. And DeLorean started to know his very pretty flower child daughter when she was 16 and then later 17, which is when he married her, and he was in his late 40s at that point.
Wow.
Now, again, you've got to look at the double life issue. So some of that reputation is, oh my God, look at who this guy got. He not only embraced the youth generation, he married it. But meanwhile, if you look into that era, Arthur Haley, kind of a best-selling potboiler writer of that time, is writing a book called Wheels. And there's an executive, and all his books were, thinly veiled fiction based on real people and whatever industry he was writing about. And he wrote about this young, hard-charging executive with this beautiful young wife who was left home alone while he was burning the midnight oil in the office. And ultimately, infidelity follows. That was the rumor of the time. Again, if you believe what DeLorean said, everybody was, how could you marry this young woman? And what are you doing going around the backyard without your shirt on and riding horses with her and all the rest? But, no doubt the marriage did not go well. They did adopt a son who was ultimately raised more by his next wife, the model Christina Ferrari, who was, where you had as big an age gap. But Kelly Harmon, soon thereafter, very soon after the marriage, started to live on the beach in California, and they quickly became estranged. And when he ultimately divorced her, like I said, only a few months later, he met Christina in the divorce lawyer's office. But if you believe DeLorean, he was going up and down the East Coast, meeting and betting all the most beautiful models and actresses. He literally said as much in a number of different interviews. And, unless he had a real busy couple of weeks, There was no way that was possible. And again, this is the way he wanted to portray himself. But he, ultimately married a very beautiful woman who, unlike Kelly Harmon, was sophisticated beyond her years. She became a young model at the age, I think, of 14. She was making huge, huge money. And her father was a butcher in Cleveland. And basically the whole family moved to Los Angeles pretty much to live off her salary as a very high-priced model. So even in her late teens, she had some older boyfriends, very accomplished entrepreneurs. So unlike Kelly Harmon, she wasn't plucked, out of the crib, so to speak. And I think, she saw in DeLorean a way to advance her career and reputation as much as he saw in her kind of a real great token to bring to parties.
Well, first of all, let me start by saying nobody handed John DeLorean anything. He was born in the ghetto in Detroit. He lived in America. This is supposed to be the land of opportunity. He worked at General Motors for many years and made top money. John has invested his money very well. When people come from nowhere and make money for themselves, why are people resentful of it? Why are they resentful because John's married to a young woman, he's got 2 kids, we seemingly had a charmed life? Why are people so angry with that? Nobody gave John anything. He worked for it.
Independent private automobile companies do not have a great history in American business. So the development of the DeLorean Motor Company, this tale, how does he make that happen?
Well, I think, again, this guy had an element. I said it's a con man. Some people could say it's a great salesperson, but there was a substantial reason behind it. Which was he did recognize talent. He was able to assemble a great group of auto executives around him, many of which I believe did more to make the company go as far as it did than he did. But starting from the top down, he had a very good concept based on his knowledge of the Corvette that there was a much bigger market for a 2-seat sports car than the Detroit auto industry was delivering. In fact, he even tried to do that at Pontiac, and basically Chevrolet, which is where Corvette lives, shut him down. So that was a good concept, that you would start with that 2-seat car where you knew there was a marketplace, especially if it was priced right, if it was priced well under the foreign import sports cars, and then use that as your stepping stone, much as Tesla has done very successfully. So he was right there. And I'm sure Tesla got, that Elon Musk, who wants nothing to do and does not want to be mentioned in the same sentence as John DeLorean. But I have no doubt that, he had a similar idea for similar reasons. So he started with that. And then the idea of the car evolved for 2 different reasons. The gull-winged doors was a classic part of the most beloved Mercedes-Benz model ever. They are a nightmare to maintain and engineer, and they were ultimately a nightmare for that car. But again, a very arresting image. And this is what happened to him. He went from that engineer to someone who didn't pay that much attention to details, was into the big picture and the image. And that was one thing that drove him. Second thing that drove him, which was another good idea, was to use a resin process. In other words, like a fiberglass, but a compressed resin that was stronger than steel, but much lighter. So this would be a superstructure for a car that really would provide performance, sports car performance, even with a much smaller fuel-efficient engine. Great idea. But one drawback of this, it was called ERM, was it couldn't be painted. And that's when he got the idea of stainless steel. And he, early on saw a car in General Motors that was made of stainless steel, and it never forgot how arresting it looked. And so that was going to be the stainless steel, the body for what he called, the ethical car. Well, ERM had problems getting mass produced, as it would have to be mass produced for an assembly line. I think Elon Musk would have held out another 6 to 12 months to make sure he could make that work. DeLorean did not. So he ultimately fell back into a fiberglass body, ultimately fell back in letting Lotus Cars produce it, engineer it. And what happened with the stainless steel? I mean, there was no way he was going back on the stainless steel. So now you had a car with two bodies. And this so-called ethical sports car came off the assembly line 900 pounds heavier than the design. And when I emphasize 900 pounds heavier, if you read on a clear day, you see him go on and on and on about the Vega and how that car came off the assembly line in Lordstown, totally unlike anything GM promised. It came out so heavy, it was 300 pounds heavier than the design. Here's the guy with his name on the car, and his car is coming out 900 pounds heavier. No way was it ever going to be a sports car. No way was it ever going to be energy efficient. It was anything but an ethical car. And that was only the beginning. I mean, the car was so poorly made. I may have been I'm not exaggerating, one of the worst made cars ever. Warranty issues over 50% of all the cars. I mean, you just read the stack of complaints that I read. Some people wrote complaints still loving him, still loving the car, but, getting stuck in the car and getting unable to get out. I mean, that happened to two of his celebrity investors, Sammy Davis Jr. and Johnny Carson. I mean, they loved looking at the car, took it for a spin, got stuck, and they had to send somebody to open up the gull-winged doors to get them out.
So in the long term, do you think he would have, if he didn't get into this other trouble and the financial problems, recognized some of these engineering shortfalls and fix them in the next iteration, and he just doesn't get to that point? Or is it gone by that point? It's too late.
It's way gone. Look, he had some excellent analysts and consultants who, J.D. Power, of course, we all know them. And they said, if you price it at this price, you will sell 15,000. You price it at this price, you will sell 5,000. Okay. They were talking like 16,000, maybe 20,000. He was up to 26,000. And again, the con man believes pretty much what he says at some point. He talks himself into it. And DeLorean, according to the executives, would say, okay, but now my name is attached to it. It's going to be that much sex. Or now this is not looked at as a real competitor of the Corvette anymore. I'm like up in BMW territory. I mean, he had every time he wanted to lift that number up. And why was he doing it? Because he wasn't going for the slow build. He was going for, again, what he accused GM for on a clear day, the quick buck. He wanted to go public. He wanted to raise enough money to put $20 million in his back pocket. And he was not going to do it in a slow build. And so as a result of that, he had to generate a large number of cars, even though he knew the US market was not going to absorb those. And another thing that was driving that was part of the deal he made with the British government was a royalty on each car that rolled off the assembly line. So it's like another real incentive for him to push those cars out. And in the beginning, there was a real novelty with the way it looked. Some of the dealers loved it, but often dealers say they'll love something, but then they're not really going to purchase it. Although he had a number of dealers who were early investors in the business. But, those warranty issues came back and really hurt him. And the price was just too high. And ultimately, I've said, those cars backed up on the docks like plague rats, from, a vampire movie. People have said, aren't those cars valuable? Well, they made as many as about 36,000. But again, you've got to be so invested to run one of those cars because there's so many issues It's underpowered. It's got battery and electrical issues, things like that. I mean, I met one person at a collector show, and he says, I can't tell you how often I've wanted to leave it by the side of a highway. And he said, the only thing that makes me stop is I would feel so guilty if some other poor sucker picked up that car and had to deal with it. So, and that's from a beloved collector.
The DeLorean. Gull-winged doors rise effortlessly, beckoning you inside. The sleek, stainless steel DeLorean. Beautifully crafted for long life. The DeLorean is one of the most awaited automobiles in automotive history. Drive the DeLorean. Live the dream today.
So in 82, he's arrested for trafficking cocaine. Is this out of desperation of the circumstance that you're talking about? Or has he been involved in these nefarious types of situations for many years under the radar?
Yeah. Again, I believe there is somewhat a case for entrapment. You know, that he had a neighbor in one of his homes, you know, it was in his interest to set something up. And again, I mean, what people have forgotten is this wasn't all just DeLorean. He attracted one of the biggest drug smugglers of cocaine from South America into this sting, who probably would have never gotten into the sting if DeLorean hadn't been involved. And why? Because coincidentally, Christina, one of her old boyfriends, would fly her around in private planes, and this drug smuggler was the pilot. And he developed, his name was Hetrick. He developed a huge crush on her and was only too excited to see her again. So the sting really accomplished something, if not the conviction of John DeLorean. It really brought down a guy who was a major guy. He had fleets of boats, fleets of planes, that big a drug smuggler. Now, where I think that the prosecution really missed the ball in a lot of ways, but was they were just so fixated on having that video of him raising up a bag of cocaine saying, this is as good as gold, and not looking, as I did, into all the deals he got into after he left GM, you know, many of which with this convicted felon, that showed he had this propensity for getting involved in illegal doings. And they just didn't feel they had to go there. And there was another trial as well that was more germane for me because it was dealt with what I wrote about, basically how he took 14 million out of the car company in those British funds and split them and put them in the back pockets of himself and the head of Lotus Cars. He should have been convicted for that. And again, by a fluke, and a real good lawyer avoided conviction in that trial. But would he have spent all that money on the car company? I don't know. I don't want to say for sure one way or the other, but he had gotten a loan out with these guys out of Ohio who were experts at buying things out of bankruptcy. And those cars were tied up really tight. And the money that you'd have to forward to get a car and get the title was such that it would have been very difficult with that sort of deal for him to just, even with the money, you know, he had gotten was a drop in the bucket in terms of what he really needed. But could it have given him a little time to play for some deal with the British government, which I doubt would have come, or was somebody willing to acquire the name? And I think that was the better opportunity for him to really salvage the car company at that point.
Out of the laundry list of unseedy and underhanded things he did or had been accused of, one of the most illegal things he actually does involves you. So what was it like when you became a target of John DeLorean?
Yes, clearly after I first wrote this article in a magazine called Monthly Detroit, which was, I should say, the first extensively negative piece that had ever been written about him, he really began to fear what I was going to put into my book. And after the drug arrest, the publishers looked around the world for somebody who had written anything negative about him or investigative in any way. And I was pretty much the only person in the United States who had. So it was kind of winning a lottery, so to speak. But I was really on a fast track to write the book and finish it before some writers in UK finished. And at that point in time, I started getting calls from an individual using a voice distorter, who I said sounded like Darth Vader with asthma. And, unfortunately, I didn't take him all that seriously. I thought he claimed to be a lawyer. I thought he had watched All the President's Men a little too much. But I also made the mistake of associating him with a very big car dealer on the Gulf Coast who I had tried to reach, who I know felt burned by being an early investor in DeLorean's motor company, and felt that there had been violations of the stock offering, what are called blue sky law violations. And soon after I tried to reach him, Darth Vader reached out to me, and I thought, oh, well, this is how he wants to get this information to me. And first he was, well, my client wants to talk to you, but he'd rather talk to you in Mexico. So fortunately, I said, I really don't have time. I'm booked for months here with plane tickets and everything. And then he said, well, where are you going to go? Anywhere in the Southwest? And I was headed for Phoenix to meet with an inventor there who DeLorean had really screwed unbelievably. And I said, sure, well, I'm at that meeting. I didn't tell him who I was going to meet with, but I'll be in Phoenix. And he said, okay, we'll meet you there. And fortunately, that didn't happen, but he had me stay at a very expensive hotel called the Camelback Lodge, where everybody was in little bungalows. The significance of that only occurred to me later. So that meeting didn't take place. He called me again just as I was leaving town. I said, look, I just don't know how I'm going to meet with your client. I'm sorry, but this is not going to work out. And, another reason my guard was down is I had a couple of people approach me really concerned about keeping it confidential. One was the member of another sting that was going on at the same time the DeLorean sting was going on, and he had heard gossip. He wanted to relate to me and met me in an airport hospitality lounge, but not till I walked in, and he could see I was alone. And then I had a former executive who had me meet him in a beach house where he kept me. I couldn't even go outside while he went through company documents with me, and felt if his name was ever exposed, it would ruin his reputation in the auto industry. So Cloak and Dagger had been somewhat a part of what I had done. So this wasn't totally outside the realm for me. But now, shortly before Easter, and my book was due in May, I get a call again from Darth Vader saying, look, I'm going to come to Detroit. My client really feels you need to see these documents before you finish your book. I said, well, that's great. I'm more than happy to meet with you. He said, well, let's meet at the airport. Sounded familiar. He said, but look, I feel you're being followed, so I want you to go to this concourse, and you'll see some payphones there. And once I see you're not being followed, one of those phones will ring. Okay, great. So I go there. I had a partner at that point, and I called him to say, I'm finally going to meet Darth Vader. And his response was, do you really want to do this? I said, believe me, this guy's kind of a joke. I'm not worried about that, anything happening. And it's in the airport. So I went to where I was told to go. The phone did ring. And then I was told, look, there's a key taped under the phone. And if you pull that key out, it will go to one of the airport lockers behind you. And in those days, there used to be airport lockers, as you entered every concourse. I said, fine. He said, you're going to find an envelope with some documents. And I have a lot more documents that, I want you to pay me for. And I said, I'm not going to pay you other than your expenses to come out here. He said, but read those documents and you'll see, I'm sure you'll want more. So I turned around, and just as he said, that key fit in one of the lockers, except there was a manila envelope that did not feel like it had too many pages in it, but it was already getting nighttime and half the concourse was empty. So I walked, deeper into the concourse to sit down, in front of an empty gate. And just as I was sitting down, I was surrounded by a lot of burly guys with flannel shirts and parkas. And one of them held open a badge and said, "What's in that envelope?" And I looked at the badge and I said, "Well, if you're from," and I could see it was Detroit Police Narcotics Department. I said, "If you're from narcotics, I suspect it's narcotics." If I was guilty, that would have been the last thing I would have said. But in those moments, you just can't believe anyone's going to believe this, or you're guilty of this. And in those days, they took me to a side room, opened up an envelope, and inside was a white packet full of powder, white powder, that turned out to be 4 grams of cocaine that could have put me in prison for 4 years. At that point, I said, "Look, I'm writing an article about John DeLorean." And the cops at that point laughed because at that stage, DeLorean was notorious for that drug bust, and his name had become synonymous, especially on late night talk shows, with cocaine. But then, I opened up my briefcase and I had that article that I wrote for Monthly Detroit, and they could see, this guy really did. And later one of them said, they always wondered why I walked into the concourse and just didn't take the drugs and leave. So that kind of raised questions in their own minds. And I just said to them, "Look, I think somebody set me up to ruin my reputation. I just want to ask you, I'll walk with you to the police car. I don't want you to put me in handcuffs." And, to their credit, they did. I think they had that inkling that this isn't typical. Nevertheless, this was the night before Easter. I went to jail, narcotics jail in Detroit. I got one call that I made to the partner who had told me not to go to the airport.
Right.
Said, "You got to find a judge to get me out of here. But whatever you do, it better not be somebody celebrating Easter tomorrow. I don't think they'll look too kindly on us calling him up on Saturday night." But ultimately, he did find someone who released me. But I still was indicted and went through a real tough time for a couple of weeks until I could clear my name. And fortunately, our friend with a voice distorter also called what we know as the wire services, AP, and in those days, UPI, to tell them I had been arrested with 4 grams of cocaine. And he called them while I was still on the way to the police station. And at that point, the people who had arrested me hadn't even weighed it, let alone knew whether or not it was truly cocaine. I don't know why they waited 10 days to put 2 and 2 together, but nevertheless, the prosecutor went before the judge. And I shouldn't have said I was indicted. I was arraigned, the next day after my arrest. But the prosecutor in Wayne County went before the judge in Detroit to say, "We believe this individual had been set up." And they dropped the charges. Now, I knew who did it. I had strong suspicions, let's put it that way. I could never talk about it. I couldn't talk about it when I was writing the book. When I was promoting the book, I should say. And I couldn't talk about it in the book at that point. But many years later, Christina Ferrari, the third wife, was deposed at one of those trials where the Lorean's lawyers were out to get their fees. And she said during that trial, DeLorean had said to her at one point, "Wouldn't it be great if Hillel Levin was set up with cocaine like I was?" And I really appreciated that she came out with that.
So what happens to DeLorean then? Does he actually end up in prison? And then what's the rest of his life like?
Well, he does not go to prison. He goes to jail after he's arrested on the drug case for a couple of weeks before he could raise bond. Again, as I said, he was acquitted on the drug case with a real good lawyer. And as I said, I think a prosecution that was a little too full of themselves. They made a huge mistake with one of the DEA agents who was somewhat testifying in a way that wasn't what they wanted, and they really went after him, and it kind of backfired. And then this excellent lawyer they had, that DeLorean had, Howard Weitzman was his name, he died recently, kind of turned it on to, here they are taking this little guy, he never did anything illegal in his life, and they're trying to make him an example. Ed Meese was clearly focused. If people remember, Ed Meese was Attorney General at that time under Reagan, and the whole just say no anti-drug thing. So all of that played together, and the jury was selected using some of the same techniques that were used later to pick the jury for O.J. Simpson. And they went to another level in the case in Detroit for what I just talked about, where they really should have had him dead to rights. And the jury was split. They tried just to get people without a college education on the jury. But they had 3 members of the jury who were college educated, who did follow all the various charges. I mean, there were more than 200 counts, I'm not kidding, in the indictment. I mean, half the jury fell asleep during the opening statements. I was at that trial. And they thought they had to hold out to convict him, but they misunderstood the judge's instructions, and the instructions related to the racketeering charges. And somehow these people felt they had to vote with majority. Again, totally misunderstanding the instructions, and the judge didn't clarify. But after the trial was over and he brought them into his chambers and said, I want to talk about this case for the classes I teach. And they raised their hands saying, why couldn't we have kept saying he was guilty? I mean, we did not think he was innocent or that he was not guilty. And so he escaped really by a fluke. But his partners in that crooked deal, namely the surviving manager at Lotus, the founder of Lotus, died of a heart attack soon after Lorean was arrested. I don't know if that was connected, but the other part of that management team was convicted in UK. They couldn't extradite DeLorean on financial grounds, but the judge had said, if DeLorean was before me now, I'd sentence him to 10 years. So he lucked out of that. But he was sued constantly. And nobody was more successful at suing him than his former attorneys, who he didn't pay. And not just Howard Weitzman, who ended up getting that ranch next to the informant, but a Detroit lawyer did sue him very successfully for millions of dollars, and basically for everything he had, including the rights to his name. So DeLorean didn't even have the rights to his name by the end of his life.
Wow.
And really everybody feels like, oh my God, he must have done so well with that, being the car in the Back to the Future.
Right. I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
That really, other than his reputation, which, I think is very fitting that it was a prop in a sci-fi movie. That was all the reputation that car deserved. But no, he didn't enrich himself from that at all. So he really died, I don't want to say destitute, but living in an apartment. All the big estates were gone, the home on Fifth Avenue, all of that had left him at that point.
So the last question I have, and you referenced it already, the Back to the Future movies now are pretty iconic. Did he know about this? Obviously, he must have known that it was in the movie. And what did he think of it? Did you ever have any conversation with him at that point?
Well, look, when I wrote about him, the first time I wrote about him was for a magazine in Detroit. And after that, we never spoke again.
Okay.
He was not a guy who was going to put up with. In fact, he took what I wrote, which was all based in fact and on legal cases and things like that, and said, what did I ever do to you? He took that personally. He later said I tried to extort him, when in fact I got on tape that he tried to bribe me, had me go to New York to bribe me. So obviously we were never going to speak again. But
he sounds like someone else that we've heard of recently.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Not to get into that.
Oh, yeah. But definitely a lot of it was very similar. And again, a belief that he could say anything and kind of get away with it. I think he was totally enchanted. And the producers of that movie to this day only have the most glowing things to say about his genius. So I have no doubt he was very happy that happened.
Well, thanks, Hillel. This was an interesting conversation, and it's amazing that John DeLorean still holds such a spot in the zeitgeist or the public imagination.
Yeah, and I just want to say, Rob, there are two movies, documentaries about him now. And I think the one that just has come out on Netflix called Myth and I'm involved in both of them, but
right, yes.
I think the Myth and Mogul does a really good job of painting all the damage he did to a lot of people, and even has his third wife, Christina, talking about him, I think, in very graphic terms, as well as his son. So I think that does a much better job of giving people a real insight into what was truly, charitably, a multifaceted character.
Well, thanks, Hillel. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
I would like to thank my guest, researcher, journalist, and author Hillel Levin. And if you would like to get his book, Grand Delusions, The Cosmic Career of John DeLorean, simply click on the link in the description below. The latest printing of the book also includes a new afterword about the extreme measures John DeLorean took against Hillel. Our featured brew was Enchantment Under the Sea Hops Double IPA from the Great Heights Brewing Company of Houston, Texas. And if you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And remember, once again, subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get those new episodes immediately, right when they're released. For more information on the podcast, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page and check out our YouTube channel as well. The music was provided by the great North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to know what they have going on, click on their link. It's in the description below as well. And finally, to our growing list of listeners and supporters from several countries and 1,000 cities across America, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
The way I see it, if you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?